Welcome to the third episode of Have We Lost Our Minds? And this week we want to talk about, are we anything other than dirt? That might be an interesting intro to this. I don't know if you're like us, but we do streaming. And when we stream, we have these conversations with each other. One of the biggest conversations we've had lately has been this errant phrase that's being tossed about, "Thank you, universe." Now, this comes in various forms. As you can tell, various people either pray to the universe or thank the universe for whatever it is that they are doing. And this is important to them, and they've suggested by these kinds of statements that the universe has some power over them or some force that they must be reliant upon. Well, here are a couple more just to give you a general sense. And the second one, actually, either they're thanking the animals specifically there, you'll notice, or there's a misspelling. So you can take that either way you would like. But nonetheless, this is Robin's general reaction when she hears, "Thank you, universe." This is what I see as I'm sitting next to her. And she literally, comes alive with this. I can't believe this is being said again. Yep, absolutely. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the universe is that it is an impersonal force or power. If it is indeed true that the universe controls everything, then it is very impersonal. So you have absolutely no commitment by the universe to you personally, though you may give thanks to it. So it's really rather inconsistent, much less hypocritical of these kinds of things, especially when you consider movies. So if you're watching these post-apocalyptic kinds of movies, like Ridley Scott's famous Prometheus, you will see aliens who are generally just trying to survive their particular generations by going into other planets and overtaking them. That's the essence of all of these things. The same would be true with all of the Alien series. The Alien series is simply that the aliens are trying to pod planets so that they can take over these planets to actually survive and get nourishment, by the way, by humanity. So humanity is going to be the way by which aliens survive. So if this issue of the universe being really the driving force behind us, then honestly, Prometheus and aliens are more true than anything else. Because if aliens come, we're just nothing but dirt. We're the ones that should be eaten in that sense. Well, let's take something a little bit more serious. There's a brand new Ken Burns documentary out called The U.S. and the Holocaust. Now, this last week I was reading Robert P. George, and in full disclosure, I haven't yet seen this episode, but in his review of this particular episode, he says this: Ken Burns failed to say that progressivism is an ideological movement deeply and firmly committed to eugenics. We'll talk about the definition for that in just a moment. He did call attention to particular figures such as Margaret Sanger, including notable political, celebrity, journalistic, business, and mainline church progressives who were fervent eugenicists. Now, this is a very important topic, and it's very interesting that Ken Burns is bringing this out now. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through. But what Robert P. George, who is Catholic, made a great point about, he said, "I heard absolutely nothing about those who opposed eugenics." And he said, guess who they were? It was the Catholic Church. Now, I just want to make a comment, generally speaking, about that. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that there should be some kind of accommodation to theology or doctrine. But I would like to point out that when I had students who were Presbyterian students, by the way, who would go to the pro-life marches back in 19 and 20, and they were going to these marches of 300,000 people. I remember this one student in particular said to me, I was one of the few Protestants there. Most of the people there were Catholics. I make the point because it doesn't really matter who it is that's standing up for life, who it is that's standing against eugenics. What matters is that a voice is being heard and that voice is actually committed to a belief in a sovereign God who is in charge of all things. So let's take this a little bit further. Eugenics is the selection of desired heritable traits to improve the human race. When you do a search of practitioners, you will find connections to Nazis and Jim Crow laws, but very few, if any, to Darwin. So you'll notice that eugenics is the kind of thing where we want to, let's take, for instance, the awfulness of the Tuskegee experiments. where black men were basically eugenicized so that they could no longer procreate. And the awfulness of this. This actually happened with other people, too, who were considered to be not intellectually able, shall we say, in their view. And of course, then they were sterilized so that they could no longer reproduce. The awfulness and the sinfulness of such abominations is beyond the pale. But what's really interesting is that guys like Ken Burns and others who will promote an anti-eugenic kind of approach will absolutely bypass this guy. They do not want to talk about Charles Darwin. Now, I want to point something out to you. If you want to just do a Google search or a Bing search, whatever your search engine is, and you go to Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, and you start looking up the images, okay? So you could click over to images and start seeing the front covers of all of the different editions of the Origin of Species. You will find very, very, very few. I counted one in my search, and the type was like font 10 or something, of the second part of this particular book that nobody ever talks about. Notice the title, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. You want to know where eugenics comes from? You want to know where the emphasis of, hey, let's get rid of this people group because we don't like them or they don't believe what we believe. Do you know where that stuff comes from? Darwinian evolution, every single time. But nobody wants to admit that. Nobody wants to point that out. Nobody even wants to have an argument about it because they would lose the argument. The problem, of course, is that we see it everywhere. Now, one of the most famous authors, especially in middle school, is Jack London. Now, I have seen even Christian people say, oh, isn't The Call of the Wild a great book, you know, how the wolves take care of each other? No. No, The Call of the Wild is a Darwinian expose of evolution. The Call of the Wild is, look at the phrases here, dog eat dog and red in tooth and claw. That's where these phrases came from, this book. And oh, by the way, the guy in the middle, that's Jack London. Jack London was a Marxist-Leninist and an evolutionist. They kind of all go together. So I want to point these kinds of things out because we have a tendency to just kind of slide past this stuff and not even think about, oh, I wonder where that came from. I wonder where the whole Prometheus Alien series came from. What is it that Ridley Scott was talking about or thinking about? Ridley Scott, by the way, in that movie was actually giving you his viewpoint of origins. That's what he believes about the origin of all things when you watch that movie. So even in the famous short story that London wrote, To Build a Fire, I mean, if you ever read this story, you will never want to go out in the snow ever again by yourself. Even with a dog. The dog ends up leaving the guy because he can't start the fire. Oh, sorry, I gave away the ending. But the point being that this is all the way through literature. Now, I could go on and on about this. I could talk about Stephen Crane, who was very famous for the Red Badge of Courage. But guess what? Stephen Crane was a nihilist. That means he basically believed in nothing, that nature doesn't care. He actually wrote this story called The Open Boat, where he said that the man wanted to throw bricks at the building, at the temple. But then he realized there were no bricks and there was no temple to throw the bricks at. What does he mean? He means there is no sense, no purpose, no nothing. This is Stephen Crane, Red Badge of Courage. They read it in junior high. Do we understand where people are coming from when they write what they write, when they produce the kinds of films that they produce? This is kind of important for us. Now, let's shift to politics, shall we? Pick a dictator. Okay, let's go left to right. Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and I put old Che Guevara in there instead of Fidel Castro. And the reason why is because of these Che Guevara t-shirts that you see on college campuses. Nothing aggravates me more than college students who have not a whit of academic research behind them to say anything about Che Guevara except that they want to wear this t-shirt because they believe he was a liberator. Go do some historic research on Che Guevara and the kind of person he was. He offed people just because he didn't like them, and he watched them die. I mean, this guy was an atrocious, atrocious person. So when I think about these kinds of folks, every single one of them an evolutionist. Check this out. It doesn't stop there. We go on to others such as Adolf Hitler. He's the one that always gets nailed for this, as well he should. But we forget about guys like Pol Pot. You remember the killing fields of Cambodia? That's Pol Pot. Or Idi Amin, Uganda in the 1970s. Basically, all of these guys took all of their people and they viewed them as minions of the state. They were cannon fodder. They didn't care about people as people. What they cared about was production, and what they cared about is if you didn't produce, then we're going to get rid of you because you really don't count any longer. Now, if you're into this kind of stuff and you want to take this a little bit further, if you've never read Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, you must run to get a copy. And here's just one line that she gives us here. Engels, Marx and Engels, this is before the Soviet Revolution, 1917, could not think of a greater compliment to Marx's scholarly achievements than to call him the Darwin of history. What were Marx and Engels and all of the communists thinking about people, generally speaking? They didn't view them as persons, they viewed them as products or producers. That's all they viewed them as. So why should I care about people? I don't care about people as long as I can send them into Stalingrad and have them killed by the hundreds and thousands in the face of 50 caliber machine gun fire by the Germans. Stalin didn't care about his warriors. All he cared about was himself and about Mother Russia, generally speaking, but really it was a very self-centered point of view. So the idea of Darwin in history is huge. So let me cut to the chase here. And by the way, this is all on the handouts, all of these lists and all of the other things. I want to point these things out to us because I think we have a tendency to kind of, again, slide over these kinds of ideas. So if you have people who say to you, well, I'm just a skeptic about everything. Well, skepticism isn't really much of a view of life. It's really just an anti-view of life. Like, you really don't want to believe in anything except that which you want to believe in. So I get this on a regular basis, university, but I hear it K-12 consistently, that, you know, we need to doubt everything. Wow. If you doubt everything, by the way, you've already established what your view of the life is, that doubt is key. So you're now a skeptic. Or materialism. If matter is all that matters, if things matter more to us than anything else, then there's a problem here. All of this comes out of an evolutionary view. Determinism, behavior, a result of mechanical stimulus and response, either by my self-identification or by biological processes. So it's not my fault no matter what, and I get to pick and choose who I am. Progress, everything is getting better. These two things, numbers 4 and 5, progress and utopia, are great evolutionary myths. There is no historic evidence for a progress where everything is getting better with humanity, nor is there with a heaven on earth as there is in utopia. So these kinds of things are natural consequences. People don't want to talk about these things, but that's what exactly gets us to where we're going, which is to this idea of assumptions. Now, this goes all the way back to episode 1, where we were talking about everybody begins with assumptions. And what I'm arguing here today is that a biblical, Hebraic, Christian view of life and things is antithetic. It is contrary, in contradistinction to an evolutionary, naturalistic, materialistic point of view. Absolutely diametrically opposed, on opposite ends of the circle. So these are assumptions that our people are making. I make an assumption about the origin of the world. My assumption about the origin of the world is going to matter about how I treat things and people in this life. So, this is what our choice is. We only have these two options. There are no other options. There's no third way here. Either you believe that there's a God who has invested himself in this world, or you believe matter is eternal. Those are your two options. Those are the assumptions that people begin with. Now, you have on this handout in front of you this big chart, and I wanted to just say a few words about each one of these ideas here. I realize there's a lot of text on here, and that's the reason why I give handouts, so people don't have to reproduce anything or write any of these notes. But I wanted to show you the very clear distinction between a designed and a chance universe. So when we talk about an evolutionary point of view, we're talking about a view of life that believes in luck, which, by the way, is not a word that we ought to use, just saying, because it has no basis of fact. There is no power behind luck. There is no personage behind chance. None of this stuff actually happens. So unless you actually believe that Las Vegas is really true, that, life is a crapshoot, I suppose then you can go in that direction. But these are the differences. So designed universe, God is eternal. Matter is eternal on the other side. Reality includes the supernatural, or it includes only the natural on the chance universe side, which is what we're focused on here today. Next week, we'll talk more about truth and the outside authority of truth, though we'll touch on it here today. Our focus, really, in terms of application, has to do with humanity. Humans are persons, not producers and not products. So if we only view people as, what have you produced for me lately, then we have actually subscribed to a naturalistic point of view. What have you done for me lately? Have you heard that phrase before? That's a naturalistic point of view that suggests I'm not looking at you as a person, but as somebody who produces for me. Work has purpose, or it's for survival. Sex is including procreation or simply self-gratification. Ethics have a transcendent source. We'll talk more about this next week. Or ethics is based on who's in control, which goes back to those dictators, by the way. They're the ones calling the shots, and it's real easy to say, this is the best thing for the country when you're the only one making the decision. Material world is good and a gift to benefit people. Matter is all that matters, which produces materialism and consumerism. And this one, and I don't know how you talk about justice without an emphasis on the afterlife. Justice is incomplete in this world. I give you that every single time. But after this life, if there is a just judge, then it makes justice in this life understandable. And we can deal with these things better. If there is no justice now, power and revenge are our only recourse. I don't know. I'd much rather live in the world on the left-hand side of that page. So, what does Scripture say about this? I mean, I could start in Genesis chapter 1. We always need to do that, by the way. Genesis 1 and 2 is the basis for how we think that we are made in God's image and have worth, value, and dignity because of that. But all of these other passages of Scripture, that God has given the world to us, that we were created for His glory, that lovely line in Isaiah chapter 43, that God created both the earth and humans and to be inhabited, and that this earth was to be useful for humanity, that humanity's purpose was to use the world and the earth that was given. The problem, of course, is that sometimes we forget who's in charge, like Ecclesiastes tells us, and then in Romans we have to be careful not to worship that which is made. And that's a real problem. And then ending, of course, with this lovely line in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 4, that everything that God created is good. So the material world is not bad by itself. It simply needs to be understood within the jurisdiction of God's sovereign control of all things. Now, I don't know how many times I've probably shown this particular slide or a slide like it in my teaching here at Crossroads, but this really summarizes all of this for me, and we'll see this slide again, I'm sure, in the future. But these two doctrinal pillars are very important for us. How do we view authority? That is, that authority must come from outside of us, and that we understand humanity as being problematic, and that we have this great tension within us between dignity and depravity, both of them being true at the same time, but accepting responsibility coming from ourselves. So these are crucial components, and the reason why theology is hugely important, and oh, by the way, then needs to be applied. You can't just talk about theology all the time without actually applying this and making sure that people understand. Speaking of which, I would like to talk about how the evolutionists steal from the Christians. And this happens all the time. It really amazes me. This goes all the way back to Carl Sagan in the 1970s, did that whole Cosmos series. By the way, Francis Schaeffer actually sent his series, his 10-part series, How Should We Then Live, to PBS, and they rejected it because they said it's too much of a worldview teaching. Have you seen Cosmos? Have you seen... Oh, my word. This just goes to show, once again, that there are people who control what we get to hear and see. And this is just one example. This is from the 1970s, but continues to be an issue. So if you're a believer in evolution, the only way that you can say anything about some kind of workable universe is if you borrow it from us. And by us, I mean a Hebraic Christian view of life and things. Now, some people will say to me, well, Are there people on the front lines of this? And I'll say, yeah. A lot of people want to talk about environmentalism, but nobody ever mentions the Cornwall Alliance, which is a very clearly Hebraic Christian group of folks who is fighting for the environmental aspects of life and things, but is focused on creation care. And you'll notice the subtext there, the stewardship of creation. So I don't use the word environment, I use the word creation because it better matches my beliefs about a creator and a creation. So is there a point of view that's actually out there from a Christian voice? Absolutely. Here's just one example. So I emphasize this to say, are there people speaking on these issues? Absolutely, yes. Now, let's get to the real crux of the matter. Going back to last week when I was talking about transcendence and immanence and the need for an outside person who's separate and apart from us at the same time who cares for us, if you don't have these as a naturalist, then you have no basis for salvation. You have no basis for judgment. You know what really rankles me? There are so many things that rankle me, but here's just one more. Just make a list of all the things that gets Mark rankled. Here's one more. All the times I'm watching, this is like Robin's face slap when she hears, "Thank you, universe." This is me when I hear any kind of comment about redemption. A basis for redemption that has no basis in redemption. There is no forgiveness. There is no Savior. There is no sacrifice. We're just looking for redemption. You can't just look for redemption. It's not there unless you have a sacrifice for the problematic issues that sin has produced. All right, sorry, I didn't mean to go off on there, but I have to collect myself again. There is an incompatibility of evolution with environmentalism. I'm just going to say this straight out. You cannot be a good environmentalist if you're an evolutionist because you believe in red and tooth and claw and dog-eat-dog world. If you're an evolutionist and an environmentalist, the only way you can say that you care about creation is if you abscond with the definition of care from a Hebraic Christian point of view. Where's that come from? Gee, I wonder. Genesis. So why should I be concerned for a creation care if evolution is truth? The great example of this is that big gray recycling bin we have at our house, where all of the plastics go in and all that. Why should I care about those things? The only reason to care about any of that is because I've been given a directive to do so. And the issue of care is really problematic as well. You see, care is an ethical term. So this is the front page of a Salvo online piece that I wrote back in January, which was about the Winter Olympics, and about, of course, it was done in Beijing, China, and China's genocide of the Uyghur people. And I wrote about this, and I wrote about the word care. And I emphasized this point. I said, care is an ethical term. Who tells you to care? Go all the way back to that slide where I talked about authority. Who's the one that gives you the authority to care? Evolution has no basis for a personal care. There is no naturalist who can point to an authority outside of dog-eat-dog world that's going to give us a reason to care. Caring is an ethical term. So let me just pause here and say, when you hear people say stuff like that, you need to ask them, what do you mean by care? And where does caring come from? And then, here's the kicker. Why should I care? Because every time you use the word should, that's an ethical term by itself. So back in the 1980s when I first started teaching in high school, we were actually learning the Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. And the reason why was because I wanted my students to be prepared for the world that they were going into. Of course, in the 80s, this was a big deal. Humanism was a real focal point. We would read articles from Free Inquiry, which was the American Humanist Association flagship journal, all that kind of stuff. And what was always fascinating to me is that every single time these guys wrote in Free Inquiry, or you can go back to the manifestos and see it for yourself, they argue for worth, value, and dignity and have absolutely no basis to argue from. They assume it to be true. Where did that come from? Out of thin air? You don't get worth, value, and dignity out of thin air, and you certainly don't get it from an evolutionary vantage point. Speaking of which, this was a phrase coined by the Germans, specifically Hitler, Nazis coined the phrase for mentally ill patients. Indeed, the first people to die in the Holocaust were German World War I amputee veterans. Now, this is absolutely fascinating when you stop to consider, once again, what's the big difference here? Either you believe humans are persons or you believe they're producers. And every single totalitarian leader ever only sees you as a producer. You only get the personhood within a system of understanding and a culture that actually subscribes to a Hebraic Christian point of view that says that all people are made in God's image. And see your left, notice the bottom there, I've actually emboldened this phrase, that utilitarian ethics, that means what's important is what's good for the many, not the one or the few. Personhood depends on productivity. So all of this came from a very famous book, Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide. But all of this is imperative for us to understand of the distinctiveness of how we think differently. And we don't need to lose our minds in this regard because we need to go back to Genesis to highlight what these things mean and why it's so important, so that we understand that human dignity and human freedom and human choice all come out of Genesis 1 and 2. And it doesn't come from any other place. And then, of course, the idea that we bear responsibility for things. Gee, how about that? Where does that come from? Right out of Genesis again. And, by the way, the rest of the Pentateuch. I know that this isn't emphasized an awful lot, but I honestly think that we ought to go back and do an awful lot of work in the law codes of Exodus 20 to 25 and Deuteronomy 20 to 25, because in those law codes, what we find are these two basic ideas. We are custodians of what God has given to us, and we are the caregivers of humanity. Both are true at the same time, and they can be actually practiced at the same time. But you must begin with an assumption that understands that people are image bearers of God. So, I want to spend a bit of time on this next number of slides because this book has been very important to me. So the book is To End All Wars. And I'm going to say at the outset, please read the book. I know there's a movie, please read the book. I remember distinctly, this was back in 2003, 2004. I was teaching at Moody at the time, and I was flying from Chicago to Los Angeles to speak, and this was my reading material. And here I am in the middle of 200 people on a plane, and the tears are just flowing down my cheeks. I'm reading this, and I can't believe what these people went through. And these people are World War II vets who were imprisoned, POW camps via the Japanese. So get a copy of Ernest Gordon's great book, To End All Wars, and read the ethos that comes out of every page of this book. It's very, very important. So he acknowledges that when he went into the POW camp, the Japanese POW camp, he was not a Christian. And what he said was his worldview was shaped by what he had learned in the 20th century was from a famous literary person named Matthew Arnold, who believed that we were on earth as a darkling plane, and then notice the last couple lines there, doomed by the processes of nature to begin to die as soon as we are born. Wow, that's a great positive view of life, isn't it? Y'all want to just jump on board for that one, don't you? Well, that was his view, and that was how he understood the world going into a POW camp. And so this is what he said after that. The rapid progress being made in the sciences indicated that man could take care of himself. This is his humanistic worldview. And unravel his own dilemma without help from a divine power, no matter how benign. Of such was the real world in which man had been placed by the evolutionary process. He acknowledges this is where it comes from. As the one creature conscious of what's going on. As he floated down the stream of history, he could know that the current would ultimately land him in utopia. Many brave worlds were being projected in those days, and mine was one of them. So he's telling you about his worldview before becoming a Christian. He's saying, this is all the stuff I believed. I believed the mythology of utopia. I believed in the evolutionary processes. I believed in all of these things. But then something happened. So when confronted by a prison camp, Gordon adds, we had no idea how soon those brave new worlds would prove to be mirages. In other words, they didn't exist. A change of heart began, however, with a simple giving of bread. It seems there were a few Christians in the camp. One believer gave up his meager meal to another prisoner. Now just pause there, and you'd have to read this in the book. It's just a phenomenal way that Gordon writes this book, and those pages are just so precious, where he talks about and gives example of these believers who literally giving up their food, which meant that they were going to die. And so it was a self-sacrifice going on in this POW camp by these Christians. And look what he says. Our regeneration, sparked by these conspicuous acts of self-sacrifice, these Christians who gave up their meals, it was dawning on us, officers and other ranks alike, that the law of the jungle is not the law of man. We had seen for ourselves how quickly it could strip most of us of our humanity and reduce us to levels lower than the beasts. And we were seeing for ourselves a sharp contrast between the forces that made for life and those that made for death. So he's in this POW camp. What better way for anybody to say, look, here's this point of view and here's this point of view. This point of view is what you came in with. This is the point of view that revolutionized and changed the camp transformationally. Through our readings and discussions, we gradually came to know Jesus. He was one of us. He would understand our problems because they were the kind of problems that he himself had faced. Most of us were accustomed to the idea we are born, we suffer, we die. Such an answer had been stamped indelibly on our minds by the many conditioning processes of the 20th century. If I had learned to trust Jesus at all, I had to trust him here. Reason said we live to die. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. I don't know of any better way for Christians to look at their culture than to recognize the soul-transforming power of the regenerative work of Jesus on the cross to be sacrificed for my sin. I look around the world and I see lots of different views of life and things, but I don't see anything even close to this one. So our concern, of course, is that we understand that our belief system actually matters and that this belief is going to affect our behavior and how we think about things. And then how we actually act in life is actually going to impinge on our belief, because if you do something long enough, it will become your belief. Everybody everywhere has these assumptions, so you either have one or the other. You can't have both unless you're going to borrow from the Hebraic Christian one, as we've suggested. Christian pre-thinking is molded by this scriptural doctrine, the reason why I make sure that every week we at least mention and talk through biblical passages to show that this is the baseline, this is the anchor by which we have our belief system. And then the doctrine that comes out of it, whether it be transcendence or immanence, doesn't matter. And that it influences our thinking ultimately. So when I'm thinking about these kinds of things, I'm asking myself questions. And so these are questions I'd like to leave with us. Where do you see the assumptions of evolution, materialism, and naturalism in your daily life? It may be something as simple as the word choices that you make. You know, I mentioned the word luck, for instance, or chance. There is no such thing from a Christian point of view. There is no impersonal force that takes time plus chance to actually create anything. So when we talk about a naturalistic view of life, am I so totally conditioned by the fact that I have only 5 senses that I forget about the 6th sense? And by the way, here's where I would want to launch into a little bit of a diatribe about how we treat the third person of the Trinity. And how we don't, well, let me start that again. I mentioned Catholic people at the beginning of this. Let me mention Pentecostals. There is something beloved by us about those who give so much emphasis to those who subscribe to a high view of the Holy Spirit. I think sometimes that we have a tendency to divide the Trinity into 3 parts and place the Holy Spirit last, as if this person in the Trinity doesn't have as much impact in our lives. But he is the one who literally indwells us. And so I think we ought to have much more of a supernatural point of view when it comes to our thinking about how we live in this world, and truly a great emphasis on what the Spirit does in our lives. Why is the Hebraic Christian view of the world and life presented in that chart important to you? Can you go through that chart and pick out certain things like work, for instance? How do you view the work that you do, the vocational emphasis of life and things? Do you see it as a gift that God's given, or simply a drudgery that has to get done? How are you expressing biblical views in your home, vocation, church, conversations with other people? Do people notice, for instance, when you talk about creation instead of the environment? Why might that be so important to people? And why should we actually make these kinds of word choices? And how, by the way, are our vocations bettered by this view of life that gives hope and care to people? And I think these kinds of things need to be given and pointed out to folks. What is the outcome of any viewpoint that you hold? Can you identify the results of your thinking? This is the constant concern that I have with folks at IUPUI where I teach, whether they be students or faculty, it doesn't matter. We all seem to agree on we want peace and justice and all of those things, but nobody can agree on the origins. And when I point out how the origins actually lead to the results, that's when the conversation breaks down, because folks don't want to admit that their assumption about origins actually matters in terms of outcomes. And then ultimately, whose thinking can you influence with any of these ideas that are presented? I think if we're going to go all the way back and consider this particular slide, that we are biblical Christians in culture, that means that we are going to have a positive impact in the places that we live and work, with the people that we live with and know, and that positive nature can actually come out in the kinds of conversations that we have with them and the kind of work that we do. Next week, we will talk about the difference between taste and truth, and we will ask the question, is it okay to eat French food or French people? That next week. See you then.